Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to yet another OpenShift Commons briefing. Today, we're going to talk about something a little bit different. We're going to talk about how all the interconnected projects and products and upstream communities are working together in the OpenShift ecosystem. And we're going to do some deep dives into the data underneath all of these communities, some GitHub log files and all kinds of interesting data sources we have. So you get some insight into how we're sort of tracking where the community is going, what projects are we need to stay on top of and connected to, and get some better understanding of how the community is growing. And today I have with me today Daniel Izquierdo, who is the Chief Data Officer from Bitergia. Bitergia has built the analytics and dashboards that we use for managing our open source community side of things. And Daniel, if you want to go, why don't you introduce yourself, and then we'll hit the slides and start going.
Perfect. So thank you very much for the introduction, Diane. I am Daniel Izquierdo. I'm one of the founders of Bitergia, and I've had the pleasure to work with Diane for the last years in understanding a bit more about OpenShift and the cross-community collaboration.
Yeah. So when we talk about community management, or if you're in the open source world and you're doing, trying to create a community for your project, we often refer to that as sort of having to have the skill set of having the art of and understanding the art of community management. But today we're going to talk about it from a slightly different perspective. So instead of art, we're going to talk about it as if from a scientific or a more data-driven, systematic approach of it. Instead of the art, we like to talk about it as the science of community management. You want to advance the slide?
Mm-hmm.
And instead of community management, we're going to talk about the science of community development. And what we mean by that really is taking a sort of a more systematic approach to some of the things that we have observed in the community, that we see, certain people showing up as connectors and mavens and, project leads and thought leaders, and try and kind of see how they connect the community and how the community, how we can see what other projects and upstream projects we need to be reaching out to and connecting with and aligning with in order to make sure that each release of OpenShift and OKD come out in conjunction with all of those. So if you want to advance the slide. So we're going to use some data analytics from Bitergia. They have created a wonderful dashboard that I've had the pleasure of using for the past couple of years now to track all of this. We're going to talk a little bit about why some of these intersections have changed over time when we pivoted from being our own OpenShift platform as a service from Origin to OKD and became a Kubernetes distribution. We're going to talk a little bit about the history. We're going to use some software development techniques, personas, to illustrate some of these connections. And we're going to talk a bit about how we've been adapting our community model and using these tools to create what we call the OpenShift Commons model. So if you can go ahead. So if you're anyone at Red Hat or you've ever sat in any Red Hat presentation, you've probably seen this slide or heard us talk about how open source is the source of everything and all of the technological innovation that's going on. And there's over 1 million plus projects out there in GitHub and 96 million repositories and people forking things and 31 million developers and 2.1 million businesses using GitHub. This is back in October of last year. And one of those projects has been one that I've been working on for the past 6 years, the OpenShift one. The advance. And so what we really talk about at Red Hat is that open source is the source of everything, that it's a necessity to have open and transparent communities that are well connected, and that we are now doing a lot of open collaboration. So in the past, it might have been just collaboration on our own project, but now it's collaboration with a number of other upstream projects, partners, hosts, and all kinds of things. And these are the connections between all of these things that really drive the continuous innovation. Can you go to the next slide? So I always jokingly refer now to OpenShift Origin as it changed its name about a year ago in August to OKD, as it's now a function of Kubernetes++. And this has been something that about almost 3 years ago in 2015, when Google donated Kubernetes to the CNCF, and Red Hat came on board and pivoted the entire architecture of our platform as a service offering, which had formerly been a MongoDB, Ruby on Rails, gears and cartridges, very different conceptually from Kubernetes in a lot of ways, and got on board. It changed the nature of our community. If you go one more slide. So really what we became was a community distribution of Kubernetes. There are some value adds, some especially around security and application lifecycle functionality and DevOps toolings that we added into OKD. But at its heart, it is a distribution of Kubernetes, which means lots of different things to lots of different people. And we'll go into that a little bit later. Next slide. There's a big lag time for me in seeing the next slide, so I apologize. Yeah, this is kind of interesting, and I can do some editing on this as well. OKD is the origin community distribution of Kubernetes. As I said, if any of you are listening to this and getting a little concerned and didn't realize we changed the names, we didn't change the name of the repo, so any of your scripts are probably just working nicely as is. So go ahead, flip to the next slide so we can get into this a little bit more. And as we did that flip to being an OpenShift, from OpenShift Origin to being a Kubernetes distribution, we at Red Hat, many of the OpenShift engineering team became involved in the Kubernetes SIGs and working groups, in each of these red little boxes show somewhere where one of a Red Hatter has been working as a co-chair on one of these projects, and it gets changes all the time. So this slide deck is, consider it out of date immediately as soon as I build it. So, but it just as we really became really deeply embedded into the upstream project Kubernetes, and we're working and doing a lot of contribution there. So that sort of changed the nature of where contributions to OpenShift itself were going. Even from our own Red Hat engineers, we were trying to push most of our contribution into Kubernetes, into the upstream. Next slide. And then in the cloud native landscape, there were a lot of things that we were looking to use besides Kubernetes. We had Prometheus, people using Jaeger, all kinds of other tooling that were part and parcel of what we deliver with OpenShift. So, and then along came, if you hit the slide one more time, another group of things called operators, which is a new concept or pattern for packaging up services and applications to run on OpenShift or on any Kubernetes. So that has introduced another whole group of projects and other upstream projects that we also still have to pay attention to. But a little bit of history here. We're going to be really open about this. The contributions to OpenShift itself, OKD, are really still dominated by Red Hat. And this is, even when we take Red Hat out, we have about 70 external contributing organizations. But the major amounts of that is really, we're not focusing on trying to get people now to contribute directly to OKD. though people still are doing so. So the reality check is, yes, we do know that Red Hat dominates the OpenShift Origin and OpenShift OKD itself. So I wanted to get Daniel to talk a little bit about the data that we're going to use to show you some of these relationships. Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you. We had this discussion about, well, who's working where. We have these three main ecosystems, or we can say OpenStack, OpenShift, and CNCF. And for the research data set that we are presenting today, what we did was to take all of the Git repositories for each of these three projects that we can see here. So for OpenStack, we are talking about 1 million and something commits with more than 70 projects, well, all of the presented projects in the case of CNCF, and then OpenShift. So this is the research data set that we are using, Git repositories for all of these projects. And the tooling we are using in this case is Lamar Lab. You can see here, basically on the left, this tooling, what it's doing is retrieve all of the data available in the usual infrastructure of open source projects. So if you think about the usual data sources, we can go for the Git repositories, GitHub infrastructure, GitLab, the Atlassian stack. So there are a bunch of them. And then all of the extraction process is done by Perceval. This is stored in Elasticsearch. And then we do have a specific tooling to deal with identities, which is kind of a complex task, as Diane can say later, because, well, you have to deal with all of the identities that we have across all of the data sources from all of the different projects we are analyzing, and of course the different ecosystems that we are analyzing, in this case CNCF, OpenStack, and OpenShift. And then everything is stored and enriched in Elasticsearch database. So then what we are going to present today is this small piece here, which are the panels that we are producing. And this is done using Kibiter, which is a soft fork of Kibana. All of this is open source, so you can access and try all of this technology in the link you have at the bottom of the slide. This is a detail of a chart that we will see afterwards in the examples we are going to use. So first, all of the pink dots are developers, and then the blue rectangles are projects in this case. So we can go for each of the projects of OpenStack, or we can go for a project at CNCF, or each of the projects in the CNCF ecosystem as well, Prometheus or Kubernetes and so on. So there is a connection if this developer has committed at least a piece of code to that repository. And then the bigger the pink dot, that means that the more repositories that developer has been working at. So basically that developer has a broader knowledge of the community, but then you can see that there are developers with a thicker edge. So that means that those developers have been contributing more commits to those specific repositories. So then we have some other examples with color dots that are organizations, and then we can analyze, let's say, the diversity of the organizations in a given community. So these are more or less the examples we can go with. So, Diane.
Okay, so we're going to use a technique called personas, and we're going to walk through some of the different personas of different kinds of people in our community. And I think it helps to really make a better understanding of who is working in the ecosystem and who is working in other spaces as well. So so they're not all Red Hat engineers, or and they're coming from lots of different points of views. So the first one we're going to look at, and there are lots of project leads, but most of you probably will recognize Clayton Coleman, and he's one of the core folks here at Red Hat working on OpenShift and on our cloud platform efforts. And if you think about all of the stuff that he's been touching in GitHub over the ages, he is actually a really good person to take a look at. And when we dove into the connections he had with different projects using this tooling, we could see him over time working on OpenStack and on a little project called Solemn there. He showed up, and these are the kinds of the things that as a person in community development and looking at it from a community ecosystem point of view, you start to see the trends in where people are working on OpenStack. They're moving from OpenStack to working on Kubernetes. And how they migrate from project to project. Sometimes as new projects become more important to their company, or they become subsumed by other ones. And so we took a look at Clayton's, and if you want to, he shows up in Kubernetes. He obviously in OpenShift Origin and OKD. He shows up in the Prometheus project and Project Atomic. And the fun part about the OpenShift one, the OpenStack one, is when he popped up on Solemn. I can remember Solemn being a small project inside of OpenStack that was focused on, providing yet another functionality for OpenStack that was almost a platform as a service. So it was a short-lived project, but he still showed up. So you can see where the topics are and where the hockey puck is going, which is a phrase I like to use, and we like to watch it. So if you want to dive into the dashboard now, Daniel, and kind of show how someone as a project lead shows up over time.
Yeah.
That would be great.
So this is the live dashboard that we have in this case for Kubernetes plus OpenShift plus OpenStack. Or not Kubernetes, but all of the CNCF ecosystem. I remember we had this conversation about Clayton and how he was evolving over the community. So we can see that Clayton in 2011, because we have here the data, as you can see on the top right, he didn't exist as a developer, as a contributor here. But then if we go for 2012, then we start seeing that Clayton started to produce a specific activity on the Origin server in the OpenShift project. And these are the 4 repositories he was working at. So we have, first case, the Origin server. Then we have others as a WordPress example in the OpenShift project. Then RHC. And then finally, we have a Django example, as you can see here. If we keep evolving this, so we go to 2013, then we have this small project Solemn, this small activity Solemn. And I remember having this discussion with you, Diane, that you didn't even remember that Solemn, that you were participating in Solemn at some point. And then you said, hey, you're right. We were having here some activity for this and this reason. So with this type of analysis, we know that Clayton was in 2013, in this case, involved for a while in Solemn, and then heavily involved, as you can see, in OpenShift. So again, Origin server and RHC are the 2 main repositories he was involved at, but in some others as OpenShift PEP or WordPress example, as you can see. Then we see this small chart here where we can go for the different repositories this developer has been working at. Okay. Remember that the big dot is in this case the developer, and then we have the blue rectangles that are the several repositories this developer has been working at. Then we go ahead, we see activity from Clayton in 2014. In this case, we see that he's been actively involved in Kubernetes. Then we see more repositories, as you can see on the left. He was as involved almost as in the case of OpenShift. So he's been working in Kubernetes.git and in OpenShift, in gear.git at OpenShift, and in Origin in OpenShift as well. We keep evolving, so we can go for 2015, more activity in Kubernetes and in OpenShift here, more and more repositories per year. Same for the next one, more repositories are added, more complex activities Clayton is producing in 2016. This is 2017 and 2018. Indeed, we can go, we have the time range here, so we can go for the last, for instance, 5 years of Clayton activity. And then we can see that this is all of the activity for Clayton for the last 5 years. I don't know, Diane, if you would like to add something else.
Yeah, so one of the things that's true with any data analytics and any, diving into any set of data sets, it's really important to note that you have to have some domain knowledge. So coming into this, if you were just going to dive into all of this and you didn't understand, what some of these projects were or how they were interrelated, it really, I think one of the reasons this works is that the folks from Bitergia obviously are working in open source and have domain knowledge around some of these, but also that I come from a background of understanding the relationship between OpenStack and know which projects that I want to dive into to look for some correlations. And as with any data analytics, it's all it's a combination of having the tooling and having some domain knowledge.
So let's go back to the presentation.
Okay, and then we'll pick the next persona here.
Yeah. So this is an example. So next persona.
So the next persona we want to talk about is an organizational one, is to taking a look at how someone who, an organization that has done some, historically has done some contribution to OKD. So we're looking at how they show up in our data sets as well. And, you know, I love this picture because, you know, I love the colliders and stuff. And in some ways, it's a lot like the union of some of the work that they've been doing on. So we know that CERN has been, you know, working with some OpenShift in the past. They've done a lot of contribution to OpenStack, and there's lots of other projects out there. So, and I'm sure we don't have all the data sets for everything that CERN is working on, but it's interesting to see from an organizational perspective with this tool, as opposed to diving down onto a single individual, how you can start to tease out what is of interest to other organizations besides yourself, besides just looking at red hatters. So if you want to dive into the dashboard for that one, that would be great.
Yeah, so this is the example we have here. If we go to the dashboard, well, what we have here is the activity of CERN in OpenStack, CNCF, OpenShift. And for the last 2 years, as you can see on the top right, typically, well, this is the projects that the CERN community is working at in the case of OpenShift, so OpenShift Ansible and OpenShift Origin. So we have the 2 developers here, but then the rest of the community that you can see around are developers working in OpenStack projects. So we can go like OpenStack Rally. We know that this developer has been working in this project, but at the same time, this project here, Hit Translator, Dep Rally, and some others as triple O image elements. Well, this is the main picture of CERN. So these 2 developers here are working on OpenShift. The rest of the activity that you can see, this is OpenStack projects, OpenStack projects and repositories. So then we can go, you can see, so instead of going for the last years, we can go for the last year in this case. So then we would be having a look at the last year activity. So we can see specific developers working in certain projects. In this case, we start seeing people working in Kubernetes for CERN. And so this is an interesting place to have a look at where the different personas are working at. So this is the activity in the case of OpenShift for the last year. Then the rest of the activity is mainly OpenStack. So let's go back to them.
And I think at this point we're looking at the data set that's just the relationship between OpenStack and Kubernetes itself. I don't think we've added in this data set all of the CNCF projects. So it's really about seeing where people are, you know, when people are working on, who they are. So this really is a great tool for me as a community development person to be able to see who are the mavens, as to use a coin a term that from Malcolm Gladwell's The Tipping Point, and the connectors. And also when I'm looking to find someone perhaps to speak on another upcoming briefing or someone to ask about an issue, this is really a great tool for me to figure out who to go to at CERN to ask these questions of, and you know, how to direct someone who might be looking for some information on a specific topic. So it's really been one of the things that's really helped me quite a bit as doing community development, to connect people and connect the dots, and make sure that we can have some really great engagement with our folks that are using OpenShift and are working on OpenShift and the related projects. If you want to go to the next persona.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we looked at a project lead, we looked at an organizational one, and I would be very I wouldn't be doing my job if I wasn't also kind of calling out some of the individual people and being able to look at this. And so if you take a look at Greg Swift, who, if any of you are on our Slack channel or anywhere else, you'll have interacted with him in some ways. He's probably the most active Slacker, shall we say, in our community, and answers tons of questions, technical ones and otherwise, and best practices in the Slack channel. And, it's interesting to see, I think he's moved on from Rackspace since we did this first presentation. And, just to see the projects that he's working on, because when you see someone rise up in the community, it's always interesting to be able to see what repos they're working on, where they're showing up, and they're also a good place to look for other connections to other projects that we should be paying attention to as community managers. So if you want to dive into him a little bit, you can see that he works on OKD. He's been working on a little bit of Jaeger. And we've now starting to pull in all of the data from the CNCF and these analysis too. So the prior ones didn't have all of the sub-projects in them. So you can see how this is, as CNCF adds new projects, there are lots more connections. So you want to explain that beautiful jellyfish diagram a little bit better, Daniel?
Yeah. So sure. What we see is, remember that we have each of the dots are developers, and then we have these small blue squares that are the projects. So what we did was to go for, well, let's look what the CNCF plus OpenShift ecosystem looks like. And then we came back with this specific analysis. So each of the dots, you can see, for instance, this is Kubernetes, the really big one ball here. So most of the developers are only working in Kubernetes. Then we can go for OpenShift, and then this is kind of a big ball as well. And then we have a big bunch of developers working only in OpenShift. But then you can see here in the middle that there are some developers working in both communities. So then we start having a specific characterization of the contributors, because those are connecting, let's say, the knowledge. They are allowing flowing knowledge from Kubernetes to OpenShift and the other way around, because they are participating in both projects. So then we can see that we have some other planets around this. So we have Nuts.io, Prometheus, Containerd, gRPC, Vitess.io, and some others that are kind of big ones. And then you can see this mess in the middle, right? So these mess are developers that are working in several projects at the same time. And then probably you see this, but let me you see that there are some projects that are in between or across all of these big projects, and they are basically having developers or contributors that are contributing to several of these projects. Perhaps, as you can see here in the OpenShift Kubernetes case, we have developers working in only these two projects. But if we have a look here, then we can see that there are developers participating in 3 projects. So we can see that they are participating in Kubernetes, in OpenShift, but in Jaeger at the same time. Then we have developers participating in Jaeger and OpenShift. And then this happens across all of the communities. We have sets of developers working in certain projects. So the question we had with Greg was, okay, so the first question I had from Diane was, where is Greg? So where is Greg participating? Because I have my specific understanding where he's participating, but I don't have the real numbers. So then we have this joint effort in terms of understanding where he was working. So this chart that you can see here, this is the same as before, but only focused on Kubernetes, OpenShift, and Jaeger. Then we have certain developers here, right? So looking for Jaeger, we realize, for Greg, sorry, we realize that Greg is working here, so in OpenShift and Jaeger at the same time. So this is where Greg Swift is working, producing specific commits. And as far as I remember, he doesn't have that many commits, but he is really important in the Slack channels. So this is the description we have. Diane?
Yeah, so you start to see some of the interrelationships between projects and people who are working on them. So you start to understand what's important to them, which is really important for us to know when we're doing community development, and we want to know, what you want to know about, what the community is looking at and working with. So things like this are quite interesting. There were a number of open tracing projects that I watched over time, Zipkin and others, And so watching sort of the rise and fall of interest in projects, you can begin to see which projects are healthy, which projects your customers and your end users are working with. So it's quite very insightful and useful tool for us to really look at and drill into. And you know, it is one of the interesting things about the universe now is there really aren't a lot of anonymous people in GitHub anymore. So we can really drill down and figure out what relationships people have to organizations as well as to projects. So this has been quite interesting. So do you want to go to the next persona?
Yeah, just to mention before that, I remember, and I think it's worth mentioning this, we can have this data over time. So that means that we can understand what's going on in a given project or in a given organization or persona. We are interested in tracking or understanding where they are going and flowing around the community. We can have this data over time, so we know that perhaps they enter at the very beginning in OpenShift, and then perhaps they move to Kubernetes and they finish their days in Jagger, for instance, participating there. So this is quite useful to understand where they are going. So next persona.
So, you know, we talked a little bit about Jaeger and open tracing before, and the one thing we do know about OpenShift and the OpenShift ecosystem is that it's not all about Kubernetes, and it's a lot about other projects. And so one of the other folks that we've had the pleasure of working with over time is Yuri from Uber, who is one of the leads for the Jaeger project and open tracing. And so we kind of need to make sure that we're not so navel gazing and focused on our own project to see where folks like from Uber and other companies are working on things, so we can also dive in and look at that information. So we take a look at Yuri, and the interesting thing is as we were diving into Yuri, we were also having these other conversations from the operator framework perspective and looking at where some of the Uber people were also writing operators that we are hoping to have run on OpenShift. So it becomes a really interesting tangle of relationships here. So if you want to describe a little bit about what you found with the Jaeger and open tracing project.
Yeah, exactly. So in this case, what we have is Uber and Rackspace and Red Hat working in the Kubernetes, OpenShift, Open Tracing, Containerd, and Jagger projects. Remember that we have the bigger the developers, so the bigger the dots, the more repositories they have been contributing to. And then we can see that where most of the activity we have, most of the people are blue, that means that they are coming from Red Hat. Then we have Uber, and then we have Rackspace. So the good point about this is that we can click here and say, well, I'm only interested in understanding what's going on with Uber. Then we can have this here. Then we save this, and then this is the activity of Uber in this project for the last couple of years. You can see here, and then this is our developer Yuri working in Jagger in this case and in open tracing. And this is the activity that Uber is taking in these two projects and in the projects that we mentioned here that are Jagger and open tracing in this case. Then in addition to Yuri, we can see other interesting developers as Wonjun, here in the top, Joe Farrell. So those are important developers as well for this community.
Yeah, if you not that I want to disrupt your process here, but then if you take off the author org name from this filter,
So you want to remove Uber?
Yeah, the Uber filter on this dashboard. You can see then take this off and see how long it takes to render here. But
that's it.
Just scratch that one. Yeah. And this is a really wonderful project dashboard to use. I mean, it allows me to manipulate the data in lots of different ways, and I really highly encourage people to take a look at how this does. But then once I've drilled down on something like Uber and I want to see the relationship between, it's still showing the Uber stuff on my screen, but Here we go.
This is the word. Mm-hmm.
For some reason, it's not deleting your filter.
Oh, no. So it's running here, but I thought that you wanted to go again to the previous project. That was all. So it's still running.
It's running in the background, yeah. So then once you've identified some sort of set of relationships and you're trying to look, and so if you wanted to find out who Yuri is interacting with at Red Hat or at another company, who else is tangentially, you can then, take off the filter, load it up and run that, and eventually you'll see it. It's a little slow on this connection here.
Yeah, in that case, what we can do is we can add only Red Hat, for instance, for what you mentioned before.
Yeah, or add Red Hat.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be easier than going through all of GitHub and finding everybody. But if I was trying to find someone, and I think what will probably show up is Gary Brown, if I remember right, is the person that's been working with them. And there's a number of other folks as well. Yeah. That might take some time to show.
Okay, it takes some time. Changing now the laptop, let's see. So here we have Red Hat and Uber. So if we go for Uber developers, they are around here. So we can see Yuri is working here. So at the same time that Yuri is working in Jagger, so we can see that from Jagger, if we follow this, we have Juracy and some other developers.
And now you can see Gary Brown show up right there in the middle. And he's, if you drill into him, and there's a number of Red Hatters, Pablo and others who are here. And you start to see all of the interrelationships with people from Red Hat and Uber. And this is quite interesting. So it's interesting to me from a community management point of view to see who has a relationship to these projects. And GitHub does come with some very basic analytics too, but this really lets you see some of the interconnectedness between the repositories and how all of these projects, which have interdependencies and their own timelines and release cycles, we now have to start coordinating all this. So now I can talk to Gary Brown and find out, more in depth about what's going on in this project, and hopefully get some insights to the timing and the release cycles and the new features and functions, and ask Gary maybe to give a presentation on that topic. So how about we drill into the next persona?
Yeah, let's go. This is Uber. Yeah, here we go. Well, this is, go ahead.
All right. If we go to the next one, and I wanted to dive a little bit into talking about this new community that we'll be adding into the data set as well as we watch this. There's a whole group of, if you think about what Docker Hub was, operatorhub.io is a repository for all of the operators that run. So you start thinking about the workloads and services that run on top of Kubernetes and on OKD and OpenShift. So out of this, knowing a little bit about Yuri, starting to watch that, we started to see all of the folks from the operator community start showing up in these maps. So if you go to the next persona.
Yep.
So then there's the corporate persona. So, and if any of you know OpenShift, the OpenShift community, Amadeus is very active, and Linnea Card has been, an amazing person to have working on this project. But this is also a matter of being able to go in and look at what is Amadeus working on. And it's been an interesting set of conversations. They've done tons of briefings on different things. They've talked about things that they're doing and where they're going and what other projects they're working on. So this kind of a tool really helps us understand where Amadeus thinks the next important thing is, or what features and functions that they're willing to contribute to or work on or pay attention to. So if you want to drill into that a little bit.
Yeah, so then for this, what we have is the relationship between Amadeus and Red Hat for the community, where the colors are not the really best ones. But what you can see is that the the red ones are Amadeus in this case, and then this is the relationship between the activity of Amadeus versus Red Hat. But then, of course, we can go only for the specifics of Amadeus. So we remove Red Hat from here, we save, and then we would see the activity of Amadeus in this case, OpenShift. So we have these developers, then we have Jagger, which is CNCF in this case, then we have Kubernetes in this other case, where we have this activity. So,
perfect.
Yeah. Next one.
You go to the next persona.
Yep.
So this is another interesting story for me, the upstream persona. So someone who's contributing in the upstream and their project, their pull request or their commit in the upstream shows up obviously in a Kubernetes distribution like OKD. And when we were doing this analysis the first time through, it showed one of the commits that showed up in upstream from Kubernetes into OKD was from this person, Kim Min, who I had no idea who that was. And so the way this tool and this sort of analytics helped me out was I could find a relationship between him and someone else at Red Hat or someone else in the community that I knew. And when I drilled down, initially he showed up, and I was very excited because I actually thought that he, it turned out to be a he, worked out at Tencent, which is a very large, Tencent is a very large cloud provider in China. And so I got all excited because I thought, oh, great, Tencent is using OKD, and I didn't know that because as an open source project, you really don't know a lot of the time who's downloading your code and deploying it anywhere. It's mostly anecdotal or how you figure out through, contributions and mapping tools like this. So I was, I saw Kim's name pop up and I'm like, yay, great. And so I reached out across the community to someone in the network diagram, Stefan Szymanski, who showed, who is working on one of those Kubernetes SIG and with Kim. And he introduced me via Slack to Kim, and Kim being in China was in another time zone. So there was a slight delay in our conversation via Slack. And then he did ping me, which was great. But then the first thing he did was correct me because he was using the Chinese equivalent to Gmail, qq.com, which is actually a Gmail-like service provided by Tencent. So he quickly told me that I wasn't correct in labeling him as a Tencent contributor. So he corrected me and said he was working for Alipay, but the work that he was doing on his own. He wasn't doing it. Initially, he said he wasn't. He was just doing this as research and bits and pieces like this, and it was just great and wonderful. And I thanked him, and it was wonderful to meet another person and in the community. And then about 2 weeks later, I got an email saying that the Red Hat and OpenShift team had started a relationship with Ali Cloud, which is Alipay is one of the subsidiaries from that, as is Alibaba. And so the relationship, I almost had this conversation with Kim Min as a precursor to knowing that someone at Ali Cloud and people at Alipay and all of these other ancillary subsidiaries of this organization were starting to look at Kubernetes. We're starting to look at OKD. And it's kind of an early warning system. And the most fun part of this whole conversation was we gave this talk last week at the Open Source Leadership Summit, and we talked about this story. And at the end of our talk, 3 gentlemen came up to the stage and introduced themselves as representatives from Tencent, and they were very happy to let me know that they were indeed using OKD, but they hadn't made any contributions yet, but they're using both OKD and OCP at Tencent. So by being able to navigate through some of this, you can find out a lot about and be able to start predicting what new organizations are interested in your project and your product. But also it's a way of discovering new relationships. And so this has been a wonderful little example of how this kind of data-driven approach allows me to find some of these people, make some of these relationships, and now we've invited Tencent to come and speak at one of our upcoming gatherings. So out of all of this, we have built a very nice relationship with the Tencent folks. I've learned a little bit about how they're using OCP for on their customer side of the house and OKD internally. And now we're going to get them to share their story as a briefing or a gathering talk sometime in the not too distant future. So it's been quite interesting. I don't know if you have a dashboard set up for this, but it was a great use of the tool.
Yeah. Yeah. This is the next slide.
So to kind of to bring this back to how this all helps, I think we've drilled down on a lot of data. What we're really trying to build with this commons model is really to change it from a singular focus on a singular project to creating an understanding that all of these projects are interrelated, and to really try and promote some of the peer-to-peer interaction. So we do that through things like today's commons briefings and gatherings and SIGs and Slack channels and that. And all of the stuff that we're doing here really helps us, and especially me as the community development director for this project, make sure that everybody is getting the information they need, that I can find the mavens and the thought leaders to give you talks, and to make sure that when new projects appear on the event horizon, we can easily bring them to your attention and do education and make sure that we have them properly resourced, and to follow these things. And if you want to go to the next slide.
Yep.
So some of the conclusions that we've made from some of this is that really it's very clear to us now that no company is working on just one thing or one project. So you can't expect, total concentration on your project. Really, we've seen some of the upstream coordination is very essential. That even though this is all data-driven, it is the relationships that matter, understanding them and knowing where you have to support them. Having domain knowledge is essential. I don't think I could do this blind without knowing a lot about Kubernetes, the interrelationship of all the SIGs, and all of the CNCF projects, as well as a lot of other projects out there like OCI and Apache projects and Eclipse projects and all of those other places. The data set we're using here doesn't include those yet, but we're always adding more data. And really to take it as an approach of this is about developing community and developing engaged communities, trying to figure out who are the people we need to be engaging with, showcasing, giving the podium over to, versus just simply community management, which is, from my point of view, really just about making sure that the contributors to your own project are happy and healthy. So that's a good, definitely needs to happen. The other piece of the puzzle here is that data matters. We've spent a significant amount of time cleaning and curating the data, as anyone who knows anything with data-driven and data analytics, your data sources have to be very heavily curated. And you do need to know your domain, and you need some good tools. The other thing that I keep reiterating to people who, even if you're using your Gmail account or whatever, qq.com or whatever it is, anonymity is pretty much dead in terms of open source. I mean, and probably out there in the world. Privacy is not dead. You can still be private. You still can, do that. And a lot of this tooling that we've shown you here today, and we've only shown you people who have public personas and who have identified themselves, but there's a lot of good reason to make sure you realize that if you're contributing to a project and you haven't told your organization yet that you are working on something, you really ought to let them know. If there's a CLA that you should be signing and you sign it as an individual instead of from an organizational or having your management's review, that's going to catch up to you in the end. So just fair warning, we do know, who you all are. And we can see from the relationships, what projects you're working on pretty easily. And if I can see it, anyone can see it. All of this data is pretty much in the public domain. So what's up next? Hopefully some more predictive analysis, perhaps in the future using some IBM Watson as we go forward in our relationship with IBM. But really, if you go to the next slide, I think this whole project is really helping us understand what we up here in Canada call skate to where the puck is going, not to where it's been. So as we look at all of these interrelationships, what really starts percolating up very as one of the key features of this is really to see what new projects are on the event horizon, how people are migrating from one project to another, and where new issues are arising in the community. So this is really a very important aspect of this data-driven approach, is that you can try and do this by your gut. You can try and do this by personal relationships, but you'll never be able to, because of the complexity and the huge number of upstream projects and the huge number of people who are working in these spaces, be able to do this truly effectively without some data-driven or science and systematic approach to it. So that's really what this project with Bitergia has been all about for me. As a person working on the OpenShift ecosystem, it would be nearly impossible for me to do what I do and to be effective and to help create an engaged community without this kind of tooling to help me navigate through all of the different projects. So I'm eternally grateful and thankful for having this great set of tools. And if you want to learn more about Bitergia and the tooling that they're providing for us here at Red Hat and for a number of other foundations out there, please feel free to reach out to Daniel or myself, and we'll connect you with them. I'm going to go to the next slide and add anything that you'd like, Daniel.
Well, you have a really great set of conclusions. So my lessons learned from this collaboration has been that when joining efforts, when you have a really deep knowledge of the ecosystem and so you have a domain knowledge, then I have in this case the tooling and some skills and experience analyzing and looking for oddities in the data set. It's been, I think we've had a really great team together to deal with all of the personas we've been going through. We have learned a lot of new things, and having this Tencent example was really, really great at the very end, because we met Tencent people during the Open Source Leadership Summit. So we had some great time together.
Yeah, no, it's been really a very interesting partnership with Bitergia, as well as with all of the upstream project folks and people who have helped us understand the different projects and how they're interrelated. So that's it's been a community effort. If you want to learn any more, please let us know. If you have any questions, you can ask them in the chat. But we're at the end of our hour, so I'm going to thank Daniel, and we'll close out for today.